sponsor and carry out this event. On July 6, 2006, a number of us activist organizations working in New York City came together under the banner of Protect Palestine after seeing and hearing about all the information that was coming out of Gaza at the time. There was a continuous, relentless Israeli attack against Gaza. One of the sharpest images, which I think stayed with us, all of us, till today, was of a young girl who had lost her whole family on the beach in Gaza when they were bombed by an Israeli airstrike. And Gaza has really been central to the whole issue of Palestine. Over and over again, it has been one of the major factors that have entailed the progression of resistance and movement. If we think back to December 1987, when the first Intifada started, the catalyst really for that was the killing of 4 Palestinian workers from Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. And even in the present, Intifada that's going on currently, or the resistance that's going on currently, one of the sharpest images that stays with us till today was the brutal killing of Mohammed Durra as his father tried to protect him. Currently, actually, there is a new investigation going on right now because a lot of the information around Mohammed Durra was suppressed. So every time we come back to trying to understand and to analyze and to look at what's going on in Gaza. But I think what's happening today that's different than what has happened in the past is, in addition to the relentless attacks by the Israeli army, in addition to the continuous bombardments and killings and injuries and imprisonment of Palestinians by the Israeli occupation, we have an international governmental embargo against the people of Gaza. And this is really, something that Luisa Morgantini, the Vice President of the EU, has called a catastrophe on civilians. It's creating a situation on the ground where there's unprecedented poverty levels, deaths, health issues, water issues, electricity issues, a continuous bombardment that's impacting on the people of Gaza. So today we're really happy and we're very lucky to have 3 distinguished guests with us to give us a kind of more understanding of what's going on in Gaza on the ground, and to try to put it within the perspective of what's going on in the region and internationally. We were supposed to have with us today Ms. Adalah-NY, but she unfortunately had to cancel. She's not feeling well, very sick, her voice is gone. She was kind enough to send a paper, which will be read by my colleague, Ms. Lubna Hamad. Ms. Adalah-NY is a journalist and she is a mother. She has a blog that she continuously puts on from Gaza, a mother from Gaza, blogspot.com. She recently co-directed the film Tunnel Trade, which aired on CBC and Al Jazeera International. And she writes on in English at jazeera.net, which if you don't read, you should. It has a lot of important information that we do not get, unfortunately, in the US media. So without further ado, I'll just invite Lubna to read the statement from Ms. Haddad.
Good evening. Usually people complain that my voice is low, so if it gets really low that you can't hear it, please let me know as I read Layla's paper. The title is Comments on the Situation in Gaza. One day, as I was reporting on the situation in Rafah, along Gaza's southernmost border with Egypt, I saw a young boy with his friend peering curiously over the fence dividing the Gaza Strip from the outside world, speaking to each other in hushed whispers. "Have you ever seen the world beyond Gaza?" One of them asked me. "What is it like?" He continued. "And what does an Egyptian boy look like?" chimed in the other. The boys were both about 10 years old, but they had never left Gaza. They had never even left the confines of their refugee camp in Rafah. It was September 2005, just days after the last Israeli troops left Gaza, completing Ariel Sharon's much-lauded disengagement. Those few days gave Gazans, such as Ahmed and Muhammad, the rare opportunity to move freely to and from Gaza as the border became temporarily porous. This was Gaza then, isolated, besieged, cut off from the world and from the West Bank and Jerusalem. So much so that young children living only meters away from their counterparts in Egyptian Rafah never had the opportunity to meet. Perhaps this will give you somewhat of a reference point for how much worse the situation has gotten. So try, if you will, to imagine Gaza now. An occupied territory that is nevertheless deemed hostile and subject to malicious boycott. A place where your electricity and fuel, where the water you drink and the air you breathe and the foods you buy in the market every day are dependent on on an outside power, where your ability to move, to study, to work, to receive medical treatment are not in your control, where every aspect of your life and the way your life is, and the way you live it is controlled by an invisible occupying power that is at the same time claims it's not controlling you, that it's not in charge of your destiny, that it's no longer responsible for all these things. Today, despite the disengagement, Gaza has become perhaps the most isolated place on earth, a situation that has been in the making long before Palestinian elections of 2006, long before the June 15th Hamas takeover of this year even. And understanding this point, understanding this reference is critical to understanding the situation in Gaza. This past September marked the 2-year anniversary of the Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip. By now, there's no debating the fact that the disengagement was little more than a policy bent on furthering Israel's strategic grip over the Gaza Strip while enabling it to skirt its legal responsibilities as occupier, much the same way that labeling Gaza hostile territory, quotation between quotes. The desired legal loopholes are the same, something I'm sure Daryl and Layla and I can further address. The result was a more strategic, in many ways more malicious occupation, where the air, borders, sea, taxation system, and population registry continued to be effectively controlled by Israel, according to the Israeli rights group Gisha in its report, Disengaged Occupiers, the Legal Status of Gaza. So just to hone in on one of these points, to put it in real terms for you, Rafah crossing, the only passage for Palestinian residents of the Gaza Strip to the outside world, was and is still controlled by Israel even after this engagement. Though they had no physical presence at the crossing, they are located in a military base about 1 kilometer away, using video monitoring devices and live feeds of passengers using the crossing. They still controlled it when it opened and closed. This was done by allowing or denying European monitors passage to the crossing from within Israel every day. After the disengagement, the crossing was open only 14% of the time on average. This closure has nothing to do with rockets being fired, nothing to do with how hostile the territory Gaza was deemed, nothing to do with tunnels. It was purely a punitive measure. An Israeli military report leaked to Haaretz last August confirmed as much, saying that Rafah would continue to be closed as means to pressure the civilian population of Gaza. These extended closures were completely arbitrary. It meant that thousands of Palestinians were denied access to Gaza and to the outside on a daily basis, to hospitals, to schools, to jobs, to family. It meant that your life and the way you live it was completely paralyzed. This is just one example. In January 2006, the occupied Palestinian territories saw arguably the first free and fair elections in the Arab Middle East. And more recently, Hamas, the victorious party, has gained control over the Gaza Strip with its rivals Fatah now in the West Bank after a failed US-funded coup. But the results of those elections were rejected by the United States and Israel, and the Palestinian people were subject to a brutal Israeli-enforced siege and an economic and political boycott led by the United States and the Middle East Quartet, Russia, the UK, the US, and the EU, and an unprecedented move against the stateless people. It seemed unconscionable, after all, that the new ruling party could not accept the very basic conditions set out by the Quartet. Renounce violence, accept past peace deals, flawed though they were, and recognize Israel, even though these same conditions have not been accepted or required of Israel. In 2006, Israel killed 700 Palestinians, half of whom were civilians, and 141 of whom were children. In the same period, Palestinians killed 23 Israelis. Over the course of these 2 years, the Palestinian economy was decimated. Unemployment and poverty reached record highs. The borders linking Gaza to the outside world and to the West Bank and Jerusalem remained hermetically sealed for the overwhelming majority of the time, trapping some 1 million Palestinians inside Gaza. Maritime access was largely denied to fishermen, destroying one of the economy's main sectors. All as Gaza continued to be subject to a barrage of Israel air and sea attacks, and Palestinians subject to illegal detentions, extrajudicial killings, and land confiscation in the West Bank. Gaza became a city decaying and debilitated. Its people exposed to the most violent form of subjugation, collectively sentenced to a life imprisoned by global powers colluding to unwind the very fabric of their society and impose an order to their liking, punishing them where no crime existed. Palestinian security began to unravel in an orchestrated attempt to overthrow Hamas. Infighting in the Gaza Strip between Hamas gunmen and Fatah's murky security forces gripped the streets for months. The most troubling part is how this malicious plot has unfolded with such purpose and yet with so little protest. When the United States' unambiguous policy of rejecting the Palestinian elections and refusing to deal with the democratically elected party failed, a new strategy was employed, that of funding, arming, and training Gaza warlord Mohammed Dahlan and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas's corrupt security forces, dubbed the Palestinian Contras by author and activist Ali Abu Nana. In fact, the architect of this policy was none other than Elliot Abrams, the Deputy National Security Advisor who was convicted for lying to Congress in the Iran-Contra deal scandal. These were the same forces wreaking havoc on Gaza's bustling streets, Banana Republic officers, in the words of Raji Sorani, director of the Gaza-based Palestinian Center for Human Rights, engaged in an orchestrated escalation of chaos. As events this past summer demonstrated, the strategy was an utter failure. The Fatah forces, which grossly outnumbered those of Hamas, were defeated in a number of days despite their training and arms in what Hamas saw as a last resort. It had observed a unilateral truce with Israel. It had given up suicide attacks against Palestinian civilians, Israeli civilians probably. It offered a unity government on several occasions and continued to be denied several key positions. But it continued to be met with intransigence, rejection, and a plot to overthrow it. However, instead of learn from past mistakes, the US administration, along with several world governments, have decided instead to attempt and further isolate Hamas and proceed with a West Bank first policy. If history is any indication, both here and elsewhere, this strategy cannot succeed. Instead of a depraved policy that is by every measure plunging Gaza further into economic disparity and widening the human tragedy to unprecedented levels, the United States, the Quartet, and other global powers must take a more inclusive approach and engage Hamas. In a scathing critique of US, EU, and Israeli policy, Alvaro de Soto, the retired UN coordinator of the Middle East, warned in a 53-page report that was leaked in June of the grave consequences that international hostility to the Palestinian Hamas movement would have. Besides sending a message to millions of Muslims that democratic methods don't work, the report warned that American pressure has pummeled into submission the UN's role as an impartial Middle East negotiator. 2 years after the disengagement, it's time for the United States to begin to take such critique to heart. Do we have time to possibly?
Maybe one of the blogs. She sent in a couple of blog entries just to give you an idea of what she writes about on her blog, and I think that it might be just pertinent to have one entry.
Yeah. This is in June 2007, leaving Gaza. We had planned to leave Gaza around the beginning of June. Our tickets were booked out of Cairo, the closest airport, and a 6-hour journey away for June 7. My parents were to come along with us for a visit. As is often the case in Gaza, things don't always go according to plan. Rafah was open erratically during the month of May and closed entirely in the week prior to our departure. we received word that the crossing would open around midnight on June 6th. Wonderful, we thought. At least we could make our flight, if only barely. We spent 14 grueling hours on the crossing, along with thousands of other Palestinians desperate to either leave or enter the Strip. Busload after busload, entire families and their children and spouses were clinging to the ceilings, crushed inside, or piled on top of the luggage in the back. Some fainted, others erupted in hysterics. Everyone had reason to. There were mothers separated from their spouses or their children, students needing to return to college, the ill, the elderly, and those with nothing particularly remarkable to preface their reason for traveling with. It was their right after all. In the early hours, there was a chill, and we warmed up with sugary mint tea and bitter coffee. But by noon, the midday sun was fierce over our heads with no place to take shade. And so we waited, and every time a bus would heave forward a few inches, our spirits would lift a tiny bit, everyone would cheer. It's difficult to put into terms what it means when a territory of 1 million people's only passage to the outside world is closed for the majority of the time, and open for only a few arbitrary, infuriatingly slow hours when it's open at all. Thousands tried to leave that day, only a few hundred of the most agile or lucky made it across. Rafah has been closed ever since.
I just really want to thank Lubna because she got the paper about 20 minutes ago. So thank you very much for agreeing to do this. What is that? But we thought it would still be important, even if Layla could not be with us, that her paper would be read. So we're also very lucky to have with us Daryl Lee, who served as information officer for the Gaza-based Palestinian Center for Human Rights. He visits Gaza regularly, and his writing has been published in the International Herald Tribune and the Journal of Palestine Studies. He co-authors reports on Gaza for Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization. He is currently a PhD candidate at Harvard University, we wish you well, and a JD candidate at Yale Law School, and he's going to be talking a little bit about how Israeli policy in Gaza is impacted or in reference to as it applies to international law. So, Mr. Daryl Lee.
Thanks. That was just still sort of reeling a bit from Layla's missive. I think what I'll do, or what I'll try to do, will be two things. One is I'll give sort of an illustrated version of Layla's talk in a way through maps. I think geography is a very important tool for understanding how the dynamics of the conflict. And the second thing that I'll try to do is situate the Gaza situation in a larger context of Israeli policy vis-a-vis the occupied territories and in the sort of general dynamic of the Zionist project as it stretches into its second century of existence. I'll make reference to international law throughout the talk, although in many ways I think one of the points that I'd like to make is to encourage us to think about the limitations of international law in framing how we understand the conflict. It's a very important tool, there are some important concepts to understand, but I think there's a sort of juridical way of looking at the conflict, which is, I'll just start with this actually, and then there's a less juridical way, and I think going back and forth will be somewhat helpful for us. So I'll just do a few slides here. That's okay.
Lights down a little bit or no?
I don't know, is this okay, or should I?
Lower them a little bit? Lights down.
Okay, how do we do that?
I think it's something good.
That's good.
Good? Okay. That's good?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the first slide. It's very simple. It's a map that's brought to us courtesy of the website of the CIA. It's from the CIA World Factbook. So this is the gospel according to the CIA. It's the map of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. West Bank, Gaza Strip, clearly delineated. These territories were taken over in 1967. Eventually, we would like these territories returned, plus or minus a little bit of land, and that's kind of the baseline that we'll be starting with. This is the Gaza Strip, as it was between 1993, the consolidation of the Oslo regime, and the disengagement. I just wanted to show this to you to give you a sense of the the very complex and multi-layered topography of the Gaza Strip. I don't know if people have visited Gaza a lot, but it's this extremely tiny space, as we're all constantly reminded. 1.4 million people living in 365 square kilometers, one of the most densely populated places on Earth. 30% of those said 365 square kilometers actually off limits to Palestinians. That would be in these in the settlement block here and here and so basically, there were the settlement blocks that were, of course, reserved exclusively for Jews, regardless of nationality, Israeli.
What color are they?
That's this block right here, this big bluish block, right? So, which includes, I'll get to that in a minute. So these orange areas and these gray areas right here are the built-up Palestinian population areas. This entire area along the border, demarcated in green, was a buffer zone that was effectively off limits to any Palestinians. Almost all of the land that was in this buffer zone was bulldozed during the Intifada. So there are these three major settlement blocks, the one all the way up in the north, the one just to the south of Gaza City, Netzarim, and then this was the Gush Katif block. Because you had these settlement blocks that were not contiguous with Israel, they all had their own roads linking them to the territories inside the Green Line. And of course, if you have a road that has settlers moving from inside of Israel to the settlement blocks, the roads themselves require security, as we all know, and these roads are actually quite short. I mean, this segment here is something like 1.5 kilometers. There was a tower every few hundred meters. So the roads were actually de facto barriers. I mean, it was literally impossible for a dog to cross the road without the Israeli military being aware of it. So roads were also a form of barriers, segmenting the Gaza Strip into these mini Gaza strips, as it were. And then finally, this area here was, I'm sorry, that's very annoying. This area here inside the settlement block was, and this one here, analogous to it, these were called yellow areas. These were basically Palestinian agricultural settlements, or Palestinian agricultural communities that were located in the shadow of the Israeli colonies. And these people probably experienced the most draconian measures out of all the people living in the Gaza Strip. So as bad as it is to live in the Gaza Strip, multiply that by several orders of magnitude, and you get the experience of living in the so-called yellow areas. People could not be visited by non-residents. They could basically not leave their homes for days or weeks at a time. Their access to markets, to schools, to clinics was severely, severely restricted. And they had that sort of, they were forced to use donkey paths that would run parallel to nice paved roads for Israelis. And of course, settlers would come and attack them from time to time in the community. So this landscape, though, has been sort of mixed up a bit since 2005. So, I mean, the basic point I think that comes across in Leila's talk, and that's important, is that disengagement, should be understood more as a continuity than a discontinuity. But before we get there, I just want to sort of highlight a few things that might have changed. So this is the Gaza Strip as it is today. This was a map produced by the United Nations. All of that sort of internal parceling of space has been radically simplified. The settlement blocks are gone. People can move between Gaza City in the north and Khan Yunis in the south. Whenever I would make the trip, it should only take about half an hour. I used to take a toothbrush with me in case we would have to sleep at the checkpoint or go back. And the first time I went back after the disengagement, it was amazing. We just sort of zipped up and down. It was quite liberating in a very small way. But there are some other things that are important to keep in mind. One is the buffer zone is back. And actually, the buffer zone never went away. I think a few weeks after disengagement, the Israeli military announced that people couldn't go near the border or else they would be shot, which basically was the situation that had obtained before. And actually, in the north, the buffer zone, the contours of the buffer zone, in case they look familiar, match up more or less exactly with the old settlement block that was there. So there is some kind of direct internal control of the ground, but then the space inside is slightly more free. You can move between Gaza City and the village next to Gaza City in a way that wasn't quite as easy before the disengagement. So just a few things to keep in mind. One is that the closure, the fence around the Gaza Strip is more or less, not quite as more, sometimes less, but more or less impenetrable. It's a hermetically sealed territory. There is no attempt on the part of Israel to hermetically seal the West Bank as such from inside the Green Line. And there are basically only 2 or 3 highly defined, highly built up points of circulation. So there's the Erez crossing, the Carney crossing, Rafah, which is in a special category. But these are basically like massive cargo terminals. They have long corridors, turnstiles, lots of infrastructure and so on. It's not a checkpoint that you might think of. For those of you who might have been to the West Bank, you might see a few jeeps by the side of the road, some concrete slabs, soldiers out there looking at people's IDs. These are massive, sort of fortifications essentially. And very, very few clearly defined points of circulation through the border. And then inside the Gaza Strip, you have the world's largest open-air prison. But, let's not be too pessimistic. It is the world's largest open-air prison. So people can move from one camp to the camp next door. I mean, these are not totally facetious points. It becomes important later on when you see what's happening in the West Bank. Just one more thing to sort of drive home that even people who do follow the conflict may not be totally aware of, which is that the attempt by the State of Israel to minimize its apparent responsibility for the situation has another practical dimension to it, which is the increasing internationalization of the occupation. International organizations, World Bank, UN, and so on, are more and more intimately involved in running Palestinian life, especially in the Gaza Strip, than ever before. Of course, we all know about UNRWA, which has been involved in basically building para-state institutions of social welfare since the Nakba. But in addition, there are the European Union monitors who are manning the border station here on Rafah, as Layla mentioned, but of course at the mercy of the Israeli military. They can't reach the border crossing unless Israel permits them to do so. All the information that they transmit goes back to Israel. Israel has the veto over what they do, but it's a European Union flag that flies over the border crossing. The entire water infrastructure of the Gaza Strip has basically been turned over to an entity called the Coastal Municipal Water Utility, which is essentially a World Bank funded project. It's run by some very competent technocrats, people who are very good, but the point is that it's not an institution that has any pretense of democratic accountability to the inhabitants of Gaza or to the Palestinian people. And of course, all of its money comes from the World Bank. Of course, the Palestinian Authority, as we know, gets about half of its revenue from the customs dues that are collected by Israel, and about the other half coming from international donors. And then finally, the Gaza electricity plant, which makes about half of the power that's produced in Gaza, which Israel bombed in June of 2006. A controlling stake in that power plant is held by a company based in Connecticut, called Morganti, which of course is a subsidiary of another larger multinational, but we can get to that later. So there are all of these different actors who are involved, and that's why the aid boycott shouldn't just be thought of as somehow analogous to a situation where a country misbehaves and aid donors decide not to donate money to it. It's actually a much deeper and more insidious form of control that's being exercised. So Israel has set up a situation in which it has minimized the cost of the occupation to itself by having all these donors sort of throw money into the situation, yet at the end of the day, it still gets to call the shots for most of what's going on. It's quite a nice deal. Just one more thing about rearranging the space in the Gaza Strip, which is that the clearing of the border areas is very important from the standpoint of kind of Zionist technologies of control. So this is the town of Rafah, town and refugee camp, which is located at the southern end of the Gaza Strip. And before disengagement, the Israeli army destroyed about 1,600 homes in the border area, displacing about 16,000 people. So this light gray area denotes what was destroyed. And then the dark gray area was the army's proposal for another round of destruction, which fortunately hasn't been carried out yet, although in the text of the disengagement plan, they reserve the right to go back in and make adjustments to the border corridor whenever they like. But the Israeli military proposal would have resulted in another 15 to 20,000 people losing their homes. And bear in mind that a lot of these people are refugees. They've been displaced from their homes once, sometimes twice or 3 times, because there were other rounds of mass house demolitions in the early 1970s, and Ariel Sharon was the head of the Southern Command. So this sort of relates back to the part of Layla's story about the boys who are sort of speaking across the fence to each other, because there's this sort of ambiguous thing going on as to whether a particular piece of fence that you see is actually a border that's separating 2 things, or if it's just a frontier where one side happens to actually be surrounded and sort of walled in. Now just moving to the West Bank, there's this, my kind of hunch with the situation, I'm not the only one to think this, but is that a lot of the texture of the occupation in the Gaza Strip is actually a much more advanced and radical phase of what Israel is trying to do in the West Bank now. I think there is some reason to believe that in some ways the conditions in the Gaza Strip represent a possible future scenario for many different parts of the West Bank, and that Israel is dividing and cantonizing Palestinian areas in the West Bank essentially to create a series of smaller Gaza strips. So this is just, I'm sure a lot of people are already familiar with the way closure works and, you know, the standard myths and counter-arguments and so on. We don't necessarily have to go through all of them. But this is a map that was recently produced by the United Nations. The red dots basically show the locations of checkpoints and roadblocks and things like this. And you get a sense of how internal movement between Palestinian areas in the West Bank is very, very restricted. I think there are somewhere between 500 and 600 checkpoints in the West Bank. But that's actually only part of the story. So if you add on this other layer, these red lines indicate roads that are primarily or sometimes exclusively used for Jews, and that Palestinians are basically not allowed to use. So there's, you know, what's happened over the past, I'd say, 15 years has been the creation and the emergence of a separate road network, one for Arabs, one for Jews. Of course, most of the Jews are also Arabs. That's another issue. We'll get to that later. But you know, basically, yeah, two road networks on top of each other. One, of course, which has an amazing kind of freedom of movement, and the other, which is, you know, sort of continuously interrupted by all the checkpoints that you saw previously. One day, I drove up and down the West Bank on the settler road network, and it was amazing. We just zipped from one end of the West Bank to the other in a couple of hours, and it was completely unlike traveling in the West Bank normally with all the sort of hindrances that are there. So you have the checkpoints, you have the roads, and then of course you also have the closed military areas. These are just areas that Israel has decided that Palestinians shouldn't be able to go to ever, with very few exceptions. Of course, most of them are in the border area. So the idea of a depopulated border that's easy to control and easy to monitor has these kinds of parallels between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So if you add all that together, plus you have a separation barrier, you know, that is how you begin to see how Palestinian areas are being cantonized and divided, and this map sort of, you know, takes into account the effects of all of those different restrictions. Just at a more micro level, this is where the Gaza and West Bank contrast kind of comes out. So the way the closure worked in the early stages in the West Bank was not quite as sophisticated as it was in Gaza. So if you recall back with the Gaza slides, you would see the Gaza Strip, you know, with this sort of hermetic 100% seal around it, whereas, you know, with these very, very built-up kinds of crossing points. So the way the closure worked in many parts of the West Bank, in the early parts of the Intifada, was much more like with Nablus here. You have this sort of patchwork of different manned checkpoints. That's what the little soldier icons are for. Little roadblocks, these triangles, and it was, you know, it was an extremely severe closure and severe enough to devastate the economy, disrupt life, make things extremely difficult, but it was not 100% airtight. People could get through. I mean, of course, you know, there's also this thing where many people who visited the West Bank have seen situations where two soldiers will be standing at a checkpoint and then a bunch of Palestinians will just be walking around the checkpoint in front of them and no one will care, which of course is humiliating and absurd, but it kind of gets at the fact that the closure was a little bit more patchy in a sense than in the Gaza Strip. But today we have a situation which is beginning to resemble Gaza a lot more. So these gray lines here basically indicate the roads that I mentioned that are essentially off limits to Palestinians, that are being controlled all the time. There are towers that have gone up. There's more permanent buildings and so on and so forth. It's still not at the level of absolute surveillance that we saw in the central parts of the Gaza Strip before disengagement, but I contend that it's sort of moving in that direction, or that they would at least like to move it in that direction. Another example, of course, is called Pelia, which is this town here that's located by the Green Line and has been encircled by the separation barrier or by the wall. This is a satellite image of the town. It's completely surrounded. It's about, I think there are about 40,000 people who live in Pelia. I haven't visited myself. If you do the math of the population density, this little enclave is actually more densely populated than the Gaza Strip. And then over here, of course, you have this Israeli settlement and all this land. Here's the village of Jayus, and then all of the land that belongs to the village is on this side, and of course that's been taken over and, you know, essentially will be annexed to the settlement and so on. So there are, again, parallels here with the yellow areas in the Gaza Strip. So relatively small, dispersed agricultural communities living next to settlements, very vulnerable to land encroachments, and living under extreme sort of control measures, you know, having to have permits to stay in their homes, having to submit to regular censuses, and so on and so forth. This basically, just to zoom back out again, I just kind of want to make the point that I think there's this interesting paradox, which is that the government of Ehud Olmert has been, you know, one of the weakest in terms of domestic Israeli politics for a very long time, lacks a lot of legitimacy, yet has been able to stay in power for quite a while. And I think I sort of want to make the point that in many ways, what Ariel Sharon was able to accomplish before he left all of us was to set up the foundations for a new stage in the consolidation and expansion of the State of Israel and of the Zionist project, which was structurally successful to the extent that even if an individual government like Olmert's happened to be incompetent or lack legitimacy or what have you, that it would be able to carry on in terms of the policies that are most important, in terms of maximizing the amount of land that would be available for Jewish settlement and minimizing the number of Arabs who would be seen to fall under the direct control of the Israeli state. And of course, the corollary of that is having the maximum number of Arabs onto the minimum amount of land. And that's sort of what this map represents. It's not a great map because it doesn't quite represent all of the unrecognized villages, but basically the black areas inside the Green Line and inside the West Bank and Gaza indicate areas of land that are available for Palestinian habitation, essentially. I mean, give or take some of the urban housing markets, that's a separate issue. But it's, you know, I think this whole trope that we always hear about Gaza being one of the most densely populated places on earth can also be retranslated into this idea that actually 1/4 of all of the Palestinians who live in the entire country or the entire area have been packed onto 1.5% of the land, namely the Gaza Strip, which I think in terms of, you know, demographic engineering and moving natives around and putting them into places where they can be easily controlled, I think is quite successful. Now there are failures in terms of being able to manipulate all of the internal politics. That's where the Hamas elections and the backfiring and all that stuff goes on. But I think, at least in my opinion, it's difficult to see a connection between the political programs of various Palestinian political parties and any kind of agenda to reverse or even to slow down this process of demographic consolidation. So anyway, this is sort of where things stand right now in terms of demographic engineering. And of course, as we all know, the sort of diplomatic benefits that were reaped by the Gaza disengagement are very useful in terms of pushing ahead colonization, not only inside the West Bank, but actually in the Naqab and the Galilee. And there are all these plans now to sort of, you know, Judaize these areas and have them settled over the next few decades. And of course, just to emphasize the success, this is an image I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The red dots indicate villages that were destroyed or depopulated during the 1948 war. Green villages are those that remain. And if you look at the demographic distribution of the native population, and then compare it with this one, the degree of concentration and the success there in the sort of, you know, historical long term is quite striking, I think. And then, of course, you know, there are other obvious comparisons that come into play. This graphic, I think, comes from a book by Benny Alon, who's a very notorious right-wing politician in Israel, and it compares the cantonization of the West Bank and Gaza to the Bantustans in South Africa. I think that the apartheid analogy, though, needs to be handled a little bit more carefully, not because of the, you know, not because if you use it, people will call you names and things like that, but because I think there are actual analytical problems with it. You know, as far as I understand, and there might be people who can speak more to this point, the Bantustan policy was about segregating native populations in terms of where they lived, but allowing them to move into the rest of South Africa so they could work and support the economy of apartheid South Africa. So that was the case with the Gaza. That's not what's happening in the Gaza Strip, and I don't think that's what's going to happen in the Gaza Strip, because Israel has made it clear that it doesn't want any more workers from Gaza. It was the case with the Gaza Strip before 1993, before the Oslo Accords. And actually there's a book that came out in 1987 called Bantustan Gaza. So in a sense, I think the idea that we should be afraid of the future Bantustan scenario for Gaza is actually somewhat misplaced. In a sense, I think Gaza has sort of already been there and already done that, as it were. And it raises very disturbing questions, because by removing the question of labor from the relationship between the State of Israel and indigenous Palestinian population, it makes it very difficult to think about productive forms of resistance that people are familiar with or might want to see that have been seen elsewhere. Such as, I mean, basically, you know, it's very difficult to see how going on strike or engaging in civil disobedience or refusing to pay taxes can actually impose any costs on a project like this that has no need for Palestinian labor, but basically is just interested in the land and is willing to be patient in terms of how it will, well, not too patient, but historically patient in terms of how it can acquire that land and go around. There's another point, I guess this is where I can say a little bit about international law, which is that people have been using the framework of international law and the laws of armed conflict, it's also called humanitarian law, for about 40 years to try to, you know, give us a vocabulary for talking about the situation and for making certain kinds of political claims. And of course, you know, using international humanitarian law confines the conversation to what's going on in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and in ending the occupation from there. I mean, I don't, you know, I don't have a massive objection to it, but I think there's an obvious problem, which is that in terms of carving out these Bantustan-like, but sort of worse than Bantustan-type territories, there isn't a very good vocabulary for dealing with that in terms of international humanitarian law. Human rights law is sort of a separate issue. We can talk about that in Q&A. But the idea that the problem that the South African state had in creating the Bantustans was, you know, there was all this sort of territory, and then they wanted to start spinning off pieces of their own territory and have the rest of the world recognize those little fiefdoms as independent states. And not only was that politically unpalatable to a lot of people, but in terms of how international law tends to work, it was very confusing to have this idea that a state would actually start, you know, giving up pieces of its own territory and trying to encourage other people to recognize them as independent when no one else did. You know, it just didn't quite work for a lot of people. The problem is that in the West Bank and Gaza, you know, the international community wants Israel to withdraw, and any piece of territory that seems to be given up is seen as a step in the right direction. But if it's done in this way where it leads to a consolidation of a much more kind of problematic regime, then I think at least that particular part of international law leaves us with, well, I mean, it's a bit wanting, I guess. So this sort of relates also to the point I made earlier about the internationalization of the occupation. So I think, you know, international legitimacy as represented by the UN and by international groups and UN resolutions and humanitarian law and so on and so forth has been a very important conceptual resource and set of rhetorical tools for solidarity or for talking about the occupation or for talking about Zionism or whatever. But there are problems that seem to be getting deeper and deeper as time goes by and as partition seems, you know, even less and less viable. I don't really have an answer for how to deal with this. I just thought it's something that I could put out there for us to think about and reflect on it critically. So that's it.
You know, people often say that you won't know, you won't understand what's going on the ground until you actually go there. But I think, if anything, that presentation provided a very vivid image of really what the situation is like on a day-to-day basis, and a very good overall conceptualization of what the problem really is. And I think one of our major issues is, if we can't use these terms that people are familiar with, how can we, you know, explain how horrific the situation is on the ground? So thank you for that. We have now with us Mr. Tawfiq Haddad. He's the co-editor with the Tikva Honik Parnas of Between the Lines, Readings in Israel, the Palestinians and the U.S. War Against Terror, which was published by Haymarket Books. We have some at a table there. You can purchase the book if you'd like. He's currently a master's student at NYU, and he's going to be talking about Gaza within the, you know, context of the regional situation. So, Mr. Tawfiq Haddad.
Thank you. Yeah, by the way, the book cover, if you take a look at it, is an image from Beit Hanun, which is a village in the north of the Gaza Strip. It's about 60 or 70% of its land, agricultural land, in part due to this sort of no man's zone, but in large part to do with the fact that Israel just wanted to sort of make it a non-viable village so that the residents would actually have to leave that area because it's located geographically relatively close to, it's actually the place where the rockets are fired from, or even though at this stage rocket development has gotten to a state where you can fire them from far further inland. But basically they want to push people a considerable distance away from the Gaza border. I was very happy. I thought the sort of two introductions that came from Layla and Daryl were wonderful, and I hope to somewhat sort of be able to sew some things together to give a little deeper perspective on what's going on. Generally, when people talk about Gaza, it's either in this, sort of in this polarity between either Gaza is this hovel mess, aggressive firing rockets. This is obviously the sort of, you know, the Israeli-U.S. version of it is this crazy mess of, you know, over-dense and crazed people, basically, and fundamentalism or whatnot. On the other side, there is also a tendency, I think, to sort of talk about Gaza just in terms of that it's a place of victimhood, basically, which, of course, you know, that is the case in with many things. But also, I think that polarity itself tends to take away some of the agency of the actors themselves and the Palestinians themselves, which I think is really important to preserve, especially if we want to understand what is Gaza, understand the political situation there, understand why Gaza today is very much so the center of Palestinian decision-making, and its implications for the future, and what's at stake there. So when we talk about Gaza, I want to sort of start by giving just a little bit of history to understand sort of what's at stake and what's part of the visual and historical and political memory of the people that are there, that comprise that 1.5 million people. As Daryl's map showed, Gaza is an area that's in its shortest, smallest, narrowest area. It's only 6 kilometers wide and 12 kilometers wide at its widest. It spans 42 kilometers up the coast from the Egyptian border all the way up. I'm sorry?
Do you want the map, or you can just
You know, it might be nice, but
just use the arrow keys to let
yeah. You know, I like this map here.
Yeah.
Is that good? Yeah. Okay, can you see? Ah, that's good. Okay. I'm sorry, what's that? Take the place, I'm sorry. I see. Okay, so it's, you see this here?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, good. It's 42 kilometers roughly from the Egyptian border, and then 6 kilometers in its narrowest around here, and then 12 on the border. And as he said, it's about 140 square miles. He said 360 square kilometers, but in miles terms it might be helpful. With an average per mile square density of 9,200 people. Depending, it has some of the most densely populated places in the world. The Jabalia refugee camp, which is right here, basically, is about 107,000 people living in 1.4 square kilometers, right there. Most of the residents of Gaza, 3/4 of whom are refugees, derived from over 300 villages in southern and central Palestine. Okay, it includes towns, it includes cities, like much of the city of Jaffa, which was one of the most developed Palestinian cities, is actually in Gaza, in addition to large Bedouin communities, which were kicked out of the Negev. It's also sort of important to point out that the expulsion of the Palestinians from their lands, and who today the residents of Gaza, actually continued well after 1948, up until 1952. There was a whole region north of Gaza here, I mean it would be known as the Fallujah Pocket, which comprised a selection of villages which were under the control of the Egyptian military up until the 50s, and eventually a deal was made so the Egyptian military would pull back and that the residents in those villages would be allowed to stay. Of course, within a couple of years, they were all kicked out and all ended up in Gaza itself. In fact, the chip factory, Intel, today is based on land that belongs to Adalah-NY, which is one of those 3 villages. Immediately after 48 and 49, this sort of period, many of the refugees attempted to return to their lands, which were, obviously there was no wall there, the hermetic ceiling of God, there was no such thing as the Gaza Strip. It's a creation, and that's sort of very important to remember. I mean, you can't give it any sense of permanency. It's the only permanency it's been able to achieve has been through sheer acts of colonialism and force. So refugees attempted to begin returning to their lands, and an entire unit was created by the Israeli military to try and prevent the return of Gaza refugees. It was known as Unit 101. It was commanded by none other than Ariel Sharon, and it was very famous for killing the refugees who were attempting to return. Benny Morrison, an Israeli historian, wrote a book about it if you're interested. As a result of this sort of the dispossession of the Palestinian people and the attempts to return and then the attacks against them, you also had independent attempts at military organizing to try and attack Israeli settlements in the general periphery. And because the Gaza Strip at the time was beneath Egyptian administration, there were elements in the Egyptian army which began organizing, feeling that it was more important to have the Fedayeen movement, the sort of first Fedayeen movement, under their control as opposed to it being independent. So a general by the name of Mustafa Habs was actually responsible for this. He was eventually killed in 1955, I believe. And then in 1956, when the military, when Israel, Great Britain, and France unilaterally attacked Egypt, you had a major massacre. In fact, the largest massacre in territorial Palestine as part of the Zionist-Arab conflict to take place, took place in Gaza, took place in Khan Yunis, right here. You had over 1,200 Egyptian soldiers who were prisoners of war who were killed. You had 550 Palestinians in Khan Yunis, where they went door to door, actually pulling out their men and killing them in different parts of the city. You had in Rafah, a week later, another 250, also the same instance, going door to door, or killing them collectively in schools. In fact, the same schools which are run today in Gaza. Of course, in 1967, you have another wave of massacres and occupation. In 1970, you have a mass popular uprising, which it came about. It was largely led by the left. It was led by a figure named Ahmed al-Aswad, who became known as Jabbar Gaza. He famously would say that Sharon might rule Gaza by day, but I run it by night. Eventually, this uprising was crushed. As Daryl mentioned, through the use of the bulldozer being a crucial instrument, a weapon of Israel policies throughout the years, much more effective than any of its bombs or its whatever, military hardware, I would say. Of course, and what they did is they actually bulldozed enormous roads that bifurcated and divided the refugee camps. And they're again making another series of refugees. So you have people, as Daryl mentioned, in Rafah refugee camp who in the past 5 years were made refugees who from their could be their fourth time becoming refugees from their own refugee camp, which is kind of a terrible irony of history which many Palestinians had to face. In 1987, the Intifada exploded out of Gaza and was sustained largely through the sacrifices of its camp population, which comprised about half of the refugee population inside Gaza. If Gaza's 3/4 refugees, half of them reside in refugee camps there. So, and of course in the last Intifada, throughout the course of the past 6 or 7 years, you've had enormous levels of damage that have been sustained in Gaza, and I'll get to that in a second. But I mean, we're talking about when I was last in Gaza, and actually where I met Layla Haddad was during the disengagement from Gaza. And at the time, Israel, and the period thereafter, Israel was launching hourly shelling attacks against Gaza. It was dropping leaflets from airplanes telling of impending war crimes, like that we will bulldoze your village if you allow these people to fire rockets from here, etc. Over 2,500 people, residents of Gaza itself, were killed during this intifada. And in addition to, I believe, something like 15% of the agricultural land in Gaza was bulldozed. So you have enormous amounts of destruction that this place has actually gone through. And this is all very much, I mean, the 48 refugees are still alive today. And so this is very much a part of the memory of Palestinians and the historical experience of Palestinians today, especially when we want to look at, like, where do movements like Hamas come up from, where does the supposed militancy of this area come from. And I think it's very important. Just, I mean, I've done a bare minimum sketch of some of the things that the people of Gaza have gone through. So, as much as it's important to highlight the particular history of Gaza, which is as different from the West Bank, because generally, especially international observers, they tend to come to the West Bank, and even when they go to the West Bank, they remain in Jerusalem or Ramallah, maybe Bethlehem. They don't get to the West Bank peripheries, let alone do they get to Gaza. And if they go to Gaza, they go to Gaza City, and they don't go to the peripheries of Gaza itself. So their entire, the histories of these places, I believe, are actually not very well documented, and that continues to this day. And that's actually that's orchestrated by the Israelis through their control of both the people of Gaza itself, its development, and geographically, of course, preventing people from leaving as well as preventing people from going. I mean, which is also bearing witness to it. I mean, I think something like 2,000 people have been allowed into Gaza since June, like June 2006, which is just, I mean, it's unbelievable. So, so the entire place has been sealed. Only 2,000 people have either left or not. So, in as much as Gaza does have a distinct political history to it, it's also important to see how it fits in with Israel's larger, or in fact, I don't want to just limit it to Israel, but into the larger events in the region, because you know, ultimately the players in this game are Israel and the United States, and like I don't think there should be really many questions about that. If there are, we can certainly take them up. But what are the interests that are at stake, and where does Gaza fit into them? Well, essentially, Israel's basic interests are to create a Jewish state, and I think there's historical continuity to that. For the last 100 years, you can see an incremental project that has successfully worked through different stages, fits and starts, of erecting and attempting to erect a homogeneous Jewish state. And in that process has successfully, in many ways, pushed out Palestinians or contained them. And so the creation of a Jewish state is what's at stake here. So what does that mean for Gaza? It basically means that you have, particularly I mean, this only became a problem for Israel in 1967 when Israel came to occupy these areas. It came to occupy what is today 1.4 million people. At the time, I actually don't have figures for how much Gaza the population was at the time, but these were non-Jews under the control of the Jewish state. Now, they existed in the West Bank and they existed in Gaza. Israel's strategic plan for these areas, non-Jewish population, which remained rooted to their land, largely because of the historical memory of 1948, which under their understanding was that Israel wanted to push them off their land. They remained rooted to their land in 1967. There was a refugee population. Most of them came from the West Bank, but the ones in Gaza and largely in the West Bank, the Palestinian population, which numbered about 1 million people in 1967, or just under, remained in place. So this question of what to do with the non-Jewish population, which is now controlled by Israel, was the predicament. And Israel basically came up with a plan known as the Adalah-NY plan for how to do it. It essentially said, you take what you want from these areas, you leave what you don't want. Okay? What you want from these areas are the water, you want the mountain tops, you want agricultural land, you want quarries, you want historically relevant sites for Zionist ideology, Jerusalem, Hebron, etc. And you want anything strategic militarily, of course. What you don't want is this Arab population. And the reality was that if you summed up all these things together, Gaza really didn't have anything strategic in it. I mean, if there were strategic interests for the West, for Israel, they lay in the West Bank. They lay in the fact that the West Bank has water, that it's agricultural, that it has Jerusalem, all this sort of stuff. But Gaza represented a problem for Israel, and it still remains a problem. And that's why, if we want to look for any solutions to the question of Palestine, always look first at what does it mean to Gaza. Because Gaza is where the refugees are. Gaza is a question of national self-determination. Gaza is a question of whether people actually have rights for themselves or not. So I think if you keep that in the back of your mind as a form of litmus test, it's kind of helpful. That's the Israeli interests that are at stake. Now, what are the U.S. interests that are at stake? Well, essentially, the U.S. interests at stake are Palestine. The question of Israel-Palestine is a part of the larger regional question. America wants to maintain its dominant hegemony over the area, regional stability. The majority of the countries in the area are pro-American. You only have a minority ones which are sort of in the axis of terror or whatnot. And America wants to basically ensure that not only does it have access to these oil networks and oil directly, it also wants to ensure that no potential counter-hegemonic ideology can spread and potentially unite itself one way or another, or some form of unity to take place. And of course, the Arab world exists in crucially geographic areas, whether it's the Sinai, whether it's the Suez Canal, whether it's the Gulf, whether it's the Straits of Gibraltar. These are all crucial areas to keep under U.S. hegemonic control. So America basically wants to make sure that Israel is kept safe, and the role that Israel plays as a state to try and subvert these kinds of forces like Arab nationalism coming up, subvert any potential threat to U.S. hegemony in the region, and then keep its Arab regimes supported. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. So where does Palestine fit into this then? Well, the question of Palestine is crucial here because Palestine and Palestinian nationalism was forged in a crucible of identification with principles of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism. It was against the British mandate, against Zionist colonization of the land, as well as the important historical ties that the Palestinian people have with the broader Arab people. So, Arab and Muslim people, world, of course, with the importance of Jerusalem there. What does that mean? It basically means Palestinian nationalism is something fundamentally unacceptable to Israeli or U.S. imperial interests in the region. It's fundamentally antithetical to Israeli because it proves the existence of another people that has an attachment to this land, etc. It's fundamentally opposed to the U.S. version of things because it raises up all the questions that America wants to bury through its policies in the region. So what does that mean? And what does that mean for Gaza in particular and for all the Palestinian areas? Well, it essentially means that Israel is afforded an amount of room to manage the crisis, manage this situation. And how do you manage it? Either you contain the Palestinians in certain areas, okay? And that's exactly what that's what Allon plan was doing, containing the Palestinians while taking the areas around them. Or it's also trying to subvert the Palestinian national movement itself. If you can't change the fact that they're Arabs in the Jewish state, you can change the fact that their identification with Palestinian nationalism. Okay, what do I mean? I mean that right now they're trying to support the Palestinian national movement that is pro-US, that sees itself as a part of the regional order, that will not bring up any of the thorny and sticky questions of anti-imperialism or whatnot. And throughout the course of the last 7 years, actually what Israel has done is it's actually worked to completely crushed the national movement. If we look historically at what Israel has done, it has killed a whole series of national leaders, from Yasser Arafat to the heads of Hamas to the heads of the left itself. It has imprisoned or assassinated wide swaths of the revolutionary cadre that the movement was able to produce. It has drastically changed the situation on the ground. And you have a situation where the Palestinians are actually, I mean, the media continues to talk about the situation in Palestine as though there's an organized Palestinian national movement, but in reality, there really isn't in many ways. It exists consciously amongst Palestinians who embrace it themselves, but the structure of the PLO is very weak right now. It's, and has big questions of legitimacy. You have obviously large internal issues that have spawned up because of Hamas's attempt because of the Hamas-Fatah split, which I think it's important to get into right now, just to basically say that, you know, in as much as Gaza has been like this site of suffering and of destitution and of despair, it's also this site of struggle. And Hamas is a product of Gaza. Hamas is a product of Gaza because it's very much on the cutting edge of every part of the anvil, between the anvil and the hammer. And Hamas is a product of this experience of refugeehood, of the internal dynamics of the Palestinian national movement, where you had a PLO which was not very democratic for many years. You have a different experiential history of the people in Gaza who no longer their experience, as it was the case with the PLO, is that of trying to erect a national movement in diaspora in different Arab countries, but actually are trying to develop a national movement inside Gaza from your experience of living in your refugee camp. And that's where Hamas comes from. Basically this lower middle class socio-economic and political strata in Palestinian society, which was marginalized by the PLO and was for its whole life essentially beneath the boot of the Israeli occupation. And so Hamas in principle is actually an attempt at reforming the national movement because of its historical ills and things which we can get into. And and a crucial part of that also is the question of the refugees, which represent the base of Hamas without question. I mean, not to say that Fatah is not a base of refugees, but it comes out of a particular, I think, experience of the experience of the Palestinian Authority, which during the Oslo years, which created amongst many Palestinians a fear that many of the basic national movement rights, such as the right of return, the full end to the occupation, the full liberation of Jerusalem, etc., that these rights could be compromised. And so for the refugees, this was crucial. This was, they had been living in refugee camps for 50 years, so you can't at this stage tell me that, okay, take some money and you're in Gaza now and we can give you a state and a postage stamp. It's, you know, like, we want to go back to our lands, which is crucial. So Hamas became the political representative of a more legitimized movement after much of the PLO had lost its credibility in the eyes of many Palestinians throughout the Oslo experience. I think I've talked a lot here. I want to open up discussion after this, but I think it's important now that I do have this opportunity to sort of talk about this to friends and allies and those who are interested in this subject, to sort of what our positions really should be in this situation. I mean, the situation in Gaza right now is drastic. I mean, it really is drastic, as you know. I don't want to belabor the point or overdo it. But I think, for instance, the fact that this room size and the amount of people who came out is low is an indicator of the fact that, you know, there's the fact that people don't know about Gaza, that it's only when things get hot that people start to come out to things. And it's sort of a very cruel situation. And in that sense, I think it's really important for us to develop a strong sense of our politics, what we're going to do from this room, and the positions we need to have, and not be fooled or muddled by what I believe is the situation. This whole internal Palestinian Fatah-Hamas split has caused a lot of confusion, particularly amongst the sympathetic forces in the West. And in that regard, I think we need to say that first and foremost support the national movement and its overall rights, ending the occupation, ending the right of return, calling for full equality of rights of Palestinian citizens in Israel. Ultimately, I think it's important to call for the de-Zionization of the state of Israel, and the recognition of what happened in 1948, etc. So a support of the broad basic goals of the Palestinian national movement, a rejection of Zionism as well as U.S. imperial interests, Zionism because it's a racist movement, and U.S. imperialism because it's fundamentally against self-determination and democracy for the peoples of the region. I think we need to support the internal reform movements of the Palestinian people, that organic process. Obviously in the West, we cannot be too much intervening in this internal dynamic of what is essentially reforming a movement which for 40 years developed out of Gulf money, and Hamas now is a part of it. That doesn't mean fundamentally supporting Hamas or not. What I'm saying is that in reality though, Hamas is leading a reform project of the Palestinian national movement. It has obviously lots of questions to it, which I think are important we shouldn't look to, but it is leading that project at this moment. And it's not the only force that's leading it. You have people in Fatah who are doing it, you have people in the left who are participating in this, and there's an internal discussion as to how we can reform the Palestinian movement, and that needs to be supported because the former structures were essentially bankrupt and remain bankrupt, and in fact the last vestiges of them in the West Bank will probably collapse in the next two or 3 years. I mean, we don't know. But essentially, this reform process is important, and it's also important for us to support the progressive forces in Palestinian society, which can form and participate and infuse this process of reform with the progressive values which uphold the basic values of individual liberty or whatnot, but not to confuse one for the other, or to confuse or withhold support for this reform project just because its quality is supposedly fundamentalist in nature or whatnot, and even that's questionable. That is questionable, and it's not even accurate at this stage. But in any case, I think, moreover, just to end things, I think it's very important to remain vigilant about the situation in Gaza. At any moment, it could explode. Of course, on a daily basis, we see, we know the slow death of Gaza and suffocation, but in reality, the drumbeats of war and the drumbeats of the saber rattling against Gaza take place on a daily basis. I have a file on my desktop that says the coming war against Gaza, and every day I get to put in a new article from the Israeli press that says some general or some Mossadnik or some whoever comes out and says, oh, the day to clobber Gaza is coming. Okay, and so we have to be very attuned to that reality, and I don't think people, it's horrifying actually, to sort of feel this sort of impendingness, because in reality, Israel does not want a reformed Palestinian national movement. It wants to destroy the national movement. It was very explicit about this, that this was its policy throughout the Intifada. The Chief of Staff, Yigal Ayalon, in this Intifada gave an important interview in 2003 in August where he said the Intifada represents cancer. What we are implementing now is chemotherapy, but it might be important to implement amputation. And he meant that was a very clear reference to the potential for ethnic cleansing to take place. Essentially, I would be very careful to note what happens at the end after this November summit, where already everyone's downplaying it, but there's the likelihood that Israel could come after and against Hamas if an agreement comes out or if an agreement doesn't come out. In both scenarios, they win, basically. They need to clobber Gaza, basically, because in many ways I see this period as similar to the period in the early 80s before the Israelis invaded South Lebanon. Israel cannot tolerate an area from which Palestinians can reconstitute their project, can reorganize themselves, and that's what actually is taking place on the ground in Gaza, despite the terrible difficulties there. So I think that opens up a lot of things to talk about, and I hope it was clarifying. Thank you.
I think because of the fact that everything that we do does have an activist component, and we don't try to do events where we're just talking about issues for the sake of talking about issues. The components that Tawfiq raised in terms of what we need to do next is very valid, and the fact that we should all walk out of here with some idea of what we can do for Gaza and for Palestine in general is very important. We have a flyer that we put out a while ago called End the Siege of Gaza, and on it there is some information about different organizations where you can provide donations to. And I think that financial donations is not something very, relevant to political activism and really making change, but it does provide some needed support on the ground, and put most of it, more than financial, is a lot of moral support to some of the local organizations, one of which is Gaza Community Mental Health Program, which is actually launching an international campaign in support of Gaza, which is very important, and you can get information about the website, on the website of the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. We also call for a boycott. Boycott of Israeli goods, academic boycott, cultural boycott, boycott in all its forms. And we're finding, and especially in July of 2006, when the assault on Gaza, when the assault on Palestine happened, it launched a widespread boycott movement internationally. In the US, it has been very difficult to start any kind of movement, but this is an ongoing discussion, an ongoing debate about what needs to be done. There's various events and activities that you can also participate in. There's the October 27th anti-war demonstration, and we will be having Adalah-NY Coalition for Justice in the Middle East contingent at the demonstration. We think it's very important for us to continuously engage the anti-war movement and tell them that Palestine is part of the issue, and they have to start making the connections between the US war on Iraq and the US-sponsored Israeli war on Palestine, because these are all connected, as is Lebanon, as is Iran, as is Syria. So we hope you'll join us. We're going to be meeting at 21st Street between Broadway and Park at 11:30. That's this Saturday. And you can keep updated on all the events that Adalah-NY will be doing, carrying out, on our website, mideastjustice.org. I have a couple of announcements of also upcoming events before we open the Q&A, because I know people leave towards the Q&A, so bear with me. October 26th at Adalah-NY, we're going to be having a potluck dinner with Mr. Samah Idris, who is the editor-in-chief of the Lebanese literary journal Al-Adab. That's going to be at 7 p.m. Everybody is welcome. Bring something with you. Another event is being sponsored by the Faculty for Israeli-Palestinian Peace, which is going to have an Israeli and a Palestinian peace activist who worked in the nonviolent resistance movement against the wall in Bil'ain, and it was one of the few really successful nonviolent resistance movements that happened. That's going to be happening here at Columbia tomorrow at 7 p.m. in room 1118 in SIPA. So you should go there. You should also be aware that from October 22nd through the 26th, a coalition of right-wing groups is organizing Islamofascism Awareness Week. You really need to oppose this. This is problematic in all of its kinds of lumping and summing and creating this continuous, idea, conceptualization of what Muslims are and what Islam is, and it's really, a very racist movement that's going on U.S. campuses right now, and that's something that people really need to be aware of, from Harvard to Columbia to most of the major universities where people are not getting tenure, or they're not getting, or they're being kicked out, or for whatever reason. We'll be coming to questions and answers.
Just another question. The Bil'ain speakers will also be at NYU on Wednesday.
Thank you.
At 8:30 p.m.
Thank you. We're going to be passing around a sign-up sheet, so if anybody wants to start getting emails from Adalah-NY, please sign on. And a donations bag. The idea is just to cover a little bit. We don't have many expenses, so the donations bag, there's no expenses. So this is purely for a donation that's going to go to Gaza through the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. So we would appreciate any donations, and you can pass this around as well if anybody wants to sign up to sign-up sheet. And I think that's everything that we needed to announce. So I want to open it up for questions. But before we do, I just wanted to provide Lubna with a chance to read the second blog from Layla al-Haddad, which is very short.
It's called The Ghostly Skies, May 2007. We're used to things going from bad to worse very quickly here. But we never expected the situation to get as bad as it has over the past few days. After a terrifying 24 hours, where a gut-wrenching cacophony of street battles and air strikes swirled around us, we awoke this morning to sporadic gunfire and ghostly streets. It was a welcome change. Sleep-deprived and anxious, my colleague Saeed, on his first visit to Gaza, and myself headed to Rafah in the southern part of the Strip to continue shooting a series of documentaries we were working on. Though the gunfire had subsided, the gunmen were still patrolling the streets, each this time casually manning their own turf, masked and fully armed. Impromptu checkpoints were still set up along the main Gaza-Rafah road, and we were stopped for ID and affiliation checks. As we approached Rafah, we received word that clashes had broken out there too, following the funeral of 4 Hamas men killed in an Israeli airstrike the night before. We decided to avoid the town center and headed instead to film near the border area along Rafah's edge. Young children blissfully flew handmade kites above the iron wall separating them from the Egyptian Rafah. Their atbaq kites flirted in the infinite sky above with kites that the wind had gently eased over from the Egyptian side. We play a game with Egyptian kids, they explained, of their unseen counterparts. We meet here through our kites and see who can catch the other kites quicker by entangling them. So far we're winning. We've got 14 Egyptian kites, he announced proudly. The children are small enough that they can wiggle their way through the cracks of the large iron gates along the wall where once Merkava tanks made their unwelcome entrance to battered camps here. And so they can call out to their Egyptian friends and learn their names and new kite flying techniques. Even then, we could hear the fearsome roar of Israeli fighter jets overhead, interspersed with the banter of machine guns from feuding factions. I then received a call from my father back in Gaza City, a tremendous explosion, the result of F-16 jet bombing near a nearby Hamas compound, had just sent intense shockwaves through our house. It was so powerful that it blasted off the windows from my cousin's home in the neighborhood behind us. This attack was followed by another, then another, and then another. There have been 6 Israeli aerial strikes since this morning. The latest one happened just as we departed Rafah from back to Gaza City. The victims this time were 2 young brothers standing near a municipality garbage truck. Even as I record this from back at home, we were shaken by another large explosion. Israeli tanks are amassing at Gaza's northern border, and unmanned Israeli drones are whirring menacingly, insistently overhead in great numbers, patrolling the ghostly skies that only the kites can reach, preparing perhaps for yet another strike against an already beating, burning, and battered Gaza.
So we're going to take some questions. We'll take a few questions from the floor and then allow the panelists to answer if that's okay. Go ahead. Najib.
I guess this is a short comment. I'll try to make it as short as possible and also with the question. This whole issue of politics of Palestinian resistance, the last week I was really surprised that you mentioned Hamas being under oppression of Israel and being ignored by, by PLO, whereas actually, Hamas and Fatah said had an open hand from Israel to do whatever they wanted in contrast to PLO. If you had a leaflet from PLO, you would be in jail, and Hamas had, a free hand. And it wasn't just an accidental policy. This is the same policy that they had in Iran, Afghanistan, and it comes to this whole issue of what they call Islamic fascism, which is, in every religion you have extremists and you have moderate. What they refer to Islamic fascism is actually the kind of Islam that they supported consistently all along, right? So for us to, I guess, we as well should have a very clear idea of how the origins of these religious forces was congealed and the consequences for it, which is, you know, a long discussion. But as far as I know, Hamas was actually promoted by Israel, and the same forces were.
Thank you. Khalid.
I think one of the successes of the Zionist project has been the spatial fragmentation of Palestinian life, and we see it in the West Bank, we see it in Gaza, we see the fact that millions of Palestinians are living, in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and all around the world. But there's also a historic and temporal fragmentation that I think has been part of the Zionist narrative, which is dividing up Palestinian history into little disconnected points. And one of the things I like in the maps that Daryl showed, and then in Tawfiq's discussion, that it's a kind of reclaiming Palestinian history is really seeing the Nakba, which started 60 years ago, as continuing for the last 60 years. I think this is a way of reclaiming Palestinian history. To see the things that are still going on now are things that started 60 years ago and have not stopped. And that's to see that and to have a continuous narrative of Palestinian life that starts from the Nakba, not only kind of spatially reunites different Palestinian communities very far around the world, not just in Palestine, but a continuity, and you see it sometimes in very graphic ways, like this summer, the few families that remain in Yafa being pushed out of their homes. It's simply something that started and has not stopped. And as we all know, this coming month is the start of a year-long commemoration of the Nakba. So there's been a global call by the UN Conference on Civil Society, which met in Brussels in August, that says basically from November 29th of this year to November 29th of next year, there should be a global commemoration of the Nakba, which we are still seeing. And I hope everyone here participates in this, which will have many different educational, mass mobilization, and so on. But it's important here not just to highlight the historic event that happened 60 years ago, but that what we see now is a continuation of that.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very moving presentation of the suffering of the Palestinian people, especially those in Gaza. That was very helpful. Now, I'm a political scientist. I'm a doctor in international relations and law, and I deal with practicalities. I'm actually giving a course on theories of international relations at the moment, but we have to be pragmatic if we want a real solution in the real world. I mean, the statements that I heard tonight calling for the de-Zionization of the State of Israel, rejection of Zionism as racism, trying to get rid of the Jewish state of 48. Now, remember in 1947, the partition plan, which everybody says is so terrible, this called for a split of mandatory Palestine after they cut away most of it to Transjordan. They didn't even ask anybody permission to make Adalah king of Transjordan. But it was splitting up Palestine west of the Jordan River into a Jewish state, an Arab, possibly an Arab state, and Jerusalem was supposed to have some international status. And that seemed, from a practical point of view, more or less a reasonable, two people arguing over the same thing, let them share. The problem was that most of the Zionists, Ben-Gurion and the leaders of the Zionist movement, the mainstream, accepted this partition, even though it was much less than what they had hoped for. It was rejected violently by the Arabs, most of the Palestinians locally, and the neighboring Arab states were invaded. You know the history.
Yeah, we do.
Okay, and it wasn't Nakba, the Arabs lost, but the point is, they missed the opportunity to negotiate. There have been several subsequent ones. You have the Oslo program, but you have Camp David II. You know, what's his name? Who was the negotiator for Bill Clinton? Dennis Ross. He worked very hard. Well, you may not like what he was working on. He was not there to destroy the state of Israel. He was there to help create a Palestinian state. I personally met with Issam Sartawi and Sabri Jaris when it was improper to do with them. And what happened? They were talking about a potentially a two-state Palestinian Israeli solution. And Issam Sartawi was murdered by, I think, some radical Palestinian in Lisbon. So the problem is, where the moderates are being killed by extremists, and there are extremists on the Israeli side too. How do you get a practical solution which will help the Palestinians? I mean, I think we don't want to continue just commemorating disasters. What can we do to create a positive future for the Palestinians where they can live in a viable state of their own, but without destroying the state of Israel? Because if the precondition of a Palestinian state is the destruction of Israel, you're not going to get it, neither in terms of international support nor the Israeli military. And that's the reality that we have to face. I have a lot of sympathy and compassion for the Palestinian people, but you have to seize practical opportunities instead of just blaming everything on the past.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes. I have two questions. The first is, do either of the speakers on the podium see any possibility of the creation of a secular democratic state? Since it's clear that Israel is more or less absorbed most of the area and is intending to ultimately ethnically cleanse Gaza. Now, my second question revolves around the last point that I just made. When that happens, do you see the potential for a generalized uprising for Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to join in and everybody to get involved? So that's my two-part question. Secular democratic state, like Joel Covell has been calling for in his new book, Overcoming Zionism, which I highly recommend everyone read. It's a great book.
All right, we're going to take one more comment from here and then allow the panelists to respond, and then if we can do another round, that'll be good, depending on time. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mustafa. I appreciate the professor's comments. I probably think that you genuinely care about the welfare of not just the Jews but also the Palestinians. However, I think you're just making a big mistake. Very quickly, if you go back to 1947, the analogy I always use is if my landlord forces me to accept someone into the guest room or to the living room. That's basically what happened. The British facilitated Jewish immigration. And then one day, actually, I was told that I'm only going to be committed to my bedroom, and I have to, get permission to use the bathroom and the kitchen. Of course, I'm going to say hell no. Absolutely, the Palestinians were right in 1947 to reject the partition of their own country. The second point related to it is a bunch of new books that have come out, not by Palestinians, by Israeli historians, and I'm sure you're an academic who'd appreciate it. The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, the most recent book that just came out a few months ago. I'd be happy to refer you to it.
By Ilan Pappé.
Ilan Pappé, who was actually forced out of Israel by death threats. He's a distinguished professor of history at Haifa. And the Israelis, while publicly accepting the 1947 partition, privately said we are going to get as much as possible out of it, and that's why these areas that were cleansed in 1948, 1949, and 1950, there was a plan to actually ethnically cleanse as many Palestinians as possible. And Ben-Gurion, in his memoirs, actually acknowledges this. It's a whole history, that the majority of people in the world actually are familiar with, unfortunately in the U.S., and probably even worse than Israel. There's this twisted history of that missed opportunity. The Arabs had the opportunity that we missed it. So I feel like that's a mistake that many people who are well-meaning, liberal, progressive, even consider themselves leftist, or make in terms of reading that history. The second mistake I think comes with the comrade here said is accepting the idea that Islamic fundamentalism is a monolithic thing, and it's Islamofascism. I mean, I don't think you'll ever shake hands with George Bush or David Horowitz, but we're repeating what these people are saying. There's a difference between groups that are ultimately reactionary like Al-Qaeda and a group like Hamas, which did accept aid from Israel back in the 1980s, but turned against it in the late 80s with the Intifada, and actually developed a completely different organization that has nothing to do with that past. I'll finish on that. Hamas is not just an Islamic fundamentalist group. Hamas is a mixture of nationalism and Islamicist ideas, because the nationalists, the PLO, and the different Arab regimes have completely become puppets to the United States and would like to cut a deal with Israel. So we have to be dynamic in looking at that. Many of the ex-nationalists and socialists who were bankrupt actually ended up as Hamas. So it's actually a mixture of Islamism, but it's really Arab nationalist project, Palestinian nationalist project, that I would love to build a progressive alternative to Hamas. The first step is to recognize that the Palestinians have the right to self-determination. We don't tell them how to fight Israel. We support the right to fight Israel. They choose the method, and the methods are really dictated by Israel.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to start with Lubna and then Daryl, and then Tawfiq, just to respond to any or all of the comments, but if you can leave it as short as possible.
Yeah, I'll start with two short comments about Gaza. First, about Hamas. Hamas is not, the problem that I'm having now as a Palestinian, talking to Western audiences about the situation in Palestine, is that a lot of people are already in the West divided between Hamas and Fatah. Those who see Fatah as the corrupt, and they are, definitely, there's no question about it, they are corrupt. And Hamas, we're talking about the leadership of these two factions, and Hamas are the clean, pure party. Well, Hamas might have been so until recently. Hamas committed a fatal mistake by forming the government. It should have foreseen what's going on. It should have kept its participation within the parliament. And by doing so, they would have been able to work on reform as they have promised, without really bringing everybody. Because they foresaw that. They knew that the Fatah leadership will not accept the defeat, and that they are not accepted by the US and Israeli leaderships. They should have seen that. Anyway, it is done, right? But to say that, as Tawfiq said, to say that Hamas is leading the reform, I think that's stretching it a little bit too far. It's not. If we have to be frank, Hamas is not leading the reform. If there's any reform effort that's currently taking place in Palestine, it's mainly the civil society, it's mainly grassroots. Those are the people who are struggling so hard for reform. Hamas is not a homogeneous body as well. Some of them are already corrupt. Many of them are actually power seekers. And some of them are as good or even better than most of us. So let's not see Hamas in this like sort of pure perspective. Let's see it in a very realistic way. And what they're doing, what they're standing for, the resistance, part of the resistance is good, but it's also, let's not forget what the resistance of Hamas and others, not only Hamas, I'm not singling out Hamas right now, but their resistance was sporadic, was not, lacked strategy and lacked vision. They were reacting to the oppression, to the enormous oppression of the Israelis, but also, let's put things in perspectives. What's going on in Gaza is partly a power struggle between Fatah and Hamas, and also partly a defense against the Israeli and the American coup, or total control of Palestinian politics. That's one thing. The other point about Gaza is that a lot of people now tend to sort of portray Gaza now as bitter, as destroyed, as having an extreme humanitarian situation, which did not exist before. That Gaza under Hamas is far worse than it was under Fatah. That's extremely untrue. That's absolutely untrue. Everything that Daryl described was the case when Fatah was in charge. So this has nothing to do. I mean, and the reason I'm raising this is that we're now here meeting to discuss the siege on Gaza, right? So it doesn't make any sense to have to sort of not see that the whole point that this has nothing to do with Hamas ruling Gaza, because actually the whole settlement, the whole confiscation, the whole demolitions, everything was taking place way before Hamas was even anywhere near the election. So it's important to note that these are long-standing policies. This is not something ad hoc, this is not something spontaneous, this is not a response to an imminent threat as a lot of people try to, or actually see it, but not necessarily try to portray it. Regarding the state of Israel, and I wish, sir, that someone told the Zionists, someone told Ben Gurion in 1938 and 39 when they had the plans, when they fought with the mandate officers over immigration to Palestine. I wish someone told them, if you're planning to establish your state at the expense of the Palestinian state, then you should really forget about it. No one said this. It's not, I mean, if you really don't see, if you really do not recognize Zionism as a racist ideology, as a racist colonialist ideology, then I think that we're missing the whole point in Palestine. This doesn't mean that we're going to kick out every Jew in Palestine. That's the sort of fear that everybody's, I mean, I was talking to some Israelis yesterday and said, so you want to kick us out? I'm not talking about the solution right now. I'm way before that. My problem is Israelis and Zionists do not even recognize the ethnic cleansing. Sir, in 1936, 1939, 1946, 1947, the Israelis had plans, not only Plan Dalet. Not only Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet was you said in 1947, the Arabs rejected the Arabs did not. They were shocked because their land was taken away from them. That's 181, the UN resolution, is the legal cover for ethnic cleansing. That I'm a lawyer, I'm an international lawyer, and for me, if anything, what Dara was saying, that international law is not always easy to use in this context, because international law has been part of this problem. Has been part of this problem since the beginning. So when you're talking about that the Israelis having accepted, or the Zionists having accepted no, they haven't accepted. They actually took more. They said, okay, we'll pretend that we're accepting. We'll take whatever we can take by force. And they had the Haganah, they had the Ergun, they had the Stern, and they had Plan Dalet, and they had the transfer committees by Weizmann.
Each other. They were not.
No, they were not fighting each other. But these are facts. So it's like my point is it's not easy. It's very easy to sort of buy into the common narrative, and that's precisely being pragmatic and being practical is what produced Oslo, and that's not going to lead us to any practical solution.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dara.
Okay, I'll try to respond to a couple of points. One, in relation to Khalida's point about thinking about history, with not allowing the succession of calamitous events to chop up Palestinian history in a certain way. I think that's a very important point, because there are important lessons from history, and I think there are important things in not reinventing the wheel. I think we have a certain notion of a continuous Palestinian history that arises in nationalist opposition to Zionism and so on and so forth, and I think that's fine, but I think that it would be helpful for all of us to do the best that we can to draw specific lessons, not just from the key turning point events, 48, 67, 87, 93, and so on, but to think in terms of the institutions and movements that guided along the way. How the PLO, for example, was stitched together in a certain way, and how it fell apart in a certain way. And also, just to give a very concrete example, and this relates to the other question about one-state solution, so-called, is the idea of a secular, democratic, non-racist state in all of Israel-Palestine was the official platform of the Palestine Liberation Organization for a very long time. And it fell by the wayside as part of the process of gaining acceptance from the United States. And I, as a student of Palestinian history, not a very good one, obviously, don't really understand what happened. I mean, I understand sort of, what happened with the Intifada and how the PLO signed up moved into the U.S. and I understand all of that, but I think there's a very important history, especially in the 1970s, at a time when there were more countries that recognized Palestine than recognized Israel, and when the PLO had extensive solidarity links with national liberation movements throughout the world. Yasser Arafat's famous speech, I mean, it's quite amazing because when you see him speaking in his later years, and then you think of his speech at the United Nations in 1974, I mean, the first half of the speech is basically a long list of shout-outs to so many other anti-colonial, anti-racist movements that existed around the world. And there was that consciousness that existed, and I think there, I mean, it's important to critique this so that we understand, what happened, why it fell apart, and what came of it. And if anyone, for example, happens to know of a good book that might have been written about this that would be useful for me to read, that would be great. But I think it's important that we kind of, and again, sort of, this other point about, whether it's international law or the internationalization of the occupation or the U.S. policy, I think there are all of these sort of things that we want to be cognizant of and to draw things out of. Back to the other point about the pragmatism question. I think this is a very teachable moment. Pragmatism is inherently relativistic, right? Something's practical or not practical in relation to a particular set of goals. And I think that political movements are successful insofar as they're able to balance what they need to do at this particular moment in time and what their long-term goal is, and not to lose sight of one over the other. And I think a very successful example of this is the Zionist movement itself. In 1898, if someone had come to you and said, hey, I think in 50 years from now there's going to be a state for the Jewish people that's going to expel 700,000 native Arabs in some remote corner of the Ottoman Empire, you'd think that this person was crazy. But I think the Zionist movement has been very good at keeping its eyes on its prize and on pursuing its goals and on making, very kind of tactical concessions and changes over time in adjusting how much control, how much responsibility is going on. I think that actually is where the value of pragmatism is for a political movement. So I think when you want to criticize the Palestinians for not being pragmatic or not being practical, I think it's very important to, evaluate the objective conditions that they face and the constraints that they face. So one of the pillars of pragmatism is, of course, this idea of partition that you brought up. There are a lot of, people make a lot of arguments about the partition plans and, in terms of real estate percentages, how much land went to one side, how much land went to the other, what was unfair. And I think, I agree with what was said previously, but I think it's also important to bear in mind that the partition plan of 1947 would have created one so-called Arab state and one so-called Jewish state. 45% of whose population would actually be non-Jewish. So basically this idea of a partition plan in which you have a state devoted to one particular ethnic group, most of whom are not even living there, at the expense of an indigenous population that was half the population, which would have meant either condemning them to perpetual second-class status or expelling them. I'm not totally sure by what metric you would consider that to be practical. And I think there's another argument, which is that the idea of insisting on this kind of polity, which is being called racist for a very specific reason, not because it's an act of Jewish national self-determination. I mean, I don't really see a problem if all Jews in the world want to create a state for themselves, as an idea. The problem is that if you want to create it in a particular place that happens to have other people living there, there are certain contradictions that arise. One of which being that if you want to insist that certain members of this group who are not citizens have more rights than certain people who live in this state who are citizens, forget about all the people who were kicked out before, that creates a set of contradictions that I think will give rise to different kinds of tension and conflict in the long term. And I'm not totally sure by what metric you would consider that practical. This project has been going on, it is now stretching into its second century. We have seen thousands of people killed and maimed, homes destroyed, lives destroyed, endless, hours and millions of man hours and women hours wasted on, ridiculous, diplomatic games and talk of this and that and other wars that were led to and so on and so forth. So I just think that the idea that it's just practical versus, completely impractical doesn't really capture any of the texture of the situation.
Perhaps picking up on there, I think the most important point is to understand that it's a project that's not over yet. Like, in fact, present-day Israel is a vehicle to continue that process of dispossessing the Palestinians and creating a Jewish state. And you see that.
I'm sorry.
Of course, because it was.
Sir,
Did they pull out of Gaza?
Please don't interrupt while the
That's an
speakers are
excellent
speaking,
example of
please.
being
Thank
pragmatic.
you.
Yes, okay.
Yes
There's
or
short
no?
terms and there's far-term goals, but in reality, Gaza, it does not represent a strategic interest for Israel, and it's important for them to sort of contain them where they are. But in the long-term perspective, I actually believe that Israel is a project that's working to push out the majority of Palestinians out of Palestine, and they did that in '48, and they're continuing to do that today. What is more important here, though, is to note the rhetorical tool that was used to justify what, in fact, was a whole series of things, including the justification behind the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, and that is the equation with the destruction of the state of Israel with the de-Zionization of Israel, to fundamentally change the structure of the ideological affiliation of the state. And that is a classic Zionist tool that they have used historically, because obviously when you begin to say, you know, insightful things like destruction of the state of Israel, it brings back a lot of very emotional and justifiably emotional things regarding Jewish history, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, etc., which we have to be very aware of and sensitive to as Palestinian activists, as humans. But it is not the same as the destruction of, it's not, you cannot make such an equation. And that is what Israel has consistently done, and therefore, under that pretense, self-defense becomes essentially, the justification of self-defense becomes a justification to do virtually everything. And Israel continues to, everything it does is a question of security, of self-defense. So, I mean, I think that's sort of, there's many other things that you said that could be broken down or whatnot, but I think that's the most important thing for people here to emphasize. And it is, what is more important is to work towards the things which will lead to actually genuine liberation of ending anti-Semitism and ending oppression of Palestinians. And that's fighting anti-Semitism, and fighting racism, and fighting colonialism, and fighting imperialism. The question of Israel does not solve anti-Semitism. It makes it more intransigent. It is based upon the principle that the non-Jew cannot extract his anti-Semitism from himself. Okay? No. There were actually a ton of progressive Jews. Zionism was a minority movement. You know this, that throughout the years. And Zionism was a reactionary part of a stream of thought which developed out of certain nationalist currents that came out of the late 18th century. And it has that whole evolution to it. And it needs to be studied. And it's not a service to Jewish liberation. And there are an increasing number of Jewish activists who are realizing that. And that's why your opinion is going to be a minority one day. And it'll be a minority amongst Jews, hopefully. So, like, I mean, and we have to fight together, all progressive activists, to try and build that kind of politics, that kind of moral understanding and sense of rights that can end all those forms of oppression. And that's why the connecting between anti-Semitism and ending racism is a crucial part, and it correlates to achieving Palestinian national liberation and the historical rights. On the question of Hamas, I think it's important to, I disagree with this line of the question of thing. Obviously I do, but I think it's actually quite important. I mean, different people use this question of Hamas as a creation of Israel to you know, for whatever their agenda is. In as much as, I mean, what are we doing here? The ideas that I've thrown out are not popular with U.S. hegemony or whatever. Does that mean I'm being funded by the U.S. state? Or you know, what I'm trying to say is, like, Hamas existed at a time when it was not deemed threatening, you know, and it actually developed over time. And, like, okay, there were elements which saw this as a potential counterbalance, but when it came to a crucial point where Hamas developed its politics and whatnot, I mean, we're talking about a movement which launched itself in 1987. Also, if we want to look at it as a function of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, the Muslim Brotherhood was fighting against, in 1947, 1948 in Gaza. So it has a history to it, you know. I mean, so all I'm trying to say is Hamas is not, and when they were talking to Israelis, they were also talking, that all the other PLO factions were talking to the Israelis as well. So those arguments are actually not viable, I do not believe. So, what to say? The only other thing not to belabor this question of Hamas, I think it's, I do think it's important to emphasize that, you know, if Hamas is I mean, you say that Hamas is not leading the reform movement, it's the civil society. Well, who is the civil society in Palestine? I mean, let's be honest here. Like, the majority.
Popular Front is the civil society.
No, there's numerous NGOs. You can't
hold on. It's a civil society is not a question of NGOs. NGOs is one sector of civil society, and it's not an internal question. But all I want to say is, if we want to talk about what is civil society in Palestine, a considerable portion of that, and I would actually argue a majority probably at this point of those who are organized by any means. I mean, those who are unorganized is a different question, but those who are unorganized are less of a question because they're unstable formations. But those who are organized is certainly Hamas, and the elections showed that. You know, in all major Palestinian cities, actually there were a couple that were not, I'll give that, but like Gaza entirely, practically entirely. I mean, like, you had here and there seats that went in Rafah and in Khan Yunis, the Fatah or whatnot, but Nablus, 13 out of 14 seats in the municipality, both on the municipal level, as well as the political level, as well as student union and other forms of trade union formations. Hamas has consistently shown that, okay, it is not a dominating majority, but it is a slight majority. Okay, and that's kind of important to point out. And we can't sort of treat it. We have to acknowledge what they have done and that historical experience, that political experience that they represent. Okay, I have a lot of differences with Hamas on all, but on another level, they do represent this stream, which we have to, at minimally, acknowledge, and let alone the fact that they are obviously democratically elected, which is a whole other question, which I won't take up here. But I think that begins to, and just to sort of wrap it up around the question of secular democratic state, look, we'll be honest, it's like, I mean, we know these things are, it's a long-term struggle. I think it's much more important for activists in this country to focus upon what are the main, instead of fighting or arguing amongst themselves about one state, two states, secular democratic, right? You know, all these 10 states or whatever, you know, the question is much more important to focus on what are those core issues that are there, like, I mean, the right of return, calling for, trying to fight against the racism of the Israeli state, ending the occupation, calling for full equality of the Palestinian citizens of Israel. I mean, this is crucial. Like, I mean, it's always a left-out factor, but this is, if there's one thing that the apartheid analogy is applicable to, it's the question of the Palestinians inside Israel. They are the ones who cannot buy 97% of the land inside Israel, and they are citizens. Okay, so so if we focus on these fronts of struggle, if we're serious about a secular democratic state, these are the things, these are the areas, the fronts which have to be strengthened, and consciousness needs to be built around, and movements and international movements need to be built around. And then once we get to that stage, then perhaps we can talk about, once we've assembled those forces which are powerful enough, then perhaps we can begin to talk about a secular democratic state. In fact, let's talk about a lot of other things. Why not? You know, like regional unity, for Christ's sake. I mean, why should Palestine be a thing? So there's many ideas. I think it's a vibrant idea. It's an important way to open up debate and discuss these things, and it's helpful. But it's also not something that should divide us at this time. We should keep our eyes on the struggle in the longer term. Thank you.
All right. With that, I'm afraid we're going to have to conclude because we're really already over time. I want to thank everybody for coming. I think that it's important that this be the start of a dialogue about what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Palestine, for you to continue to maintain, be active, and engaged in what's going on. And there's a lot of information out there. It doesn't come through U.S. media, but you can find it if you look for it. So, thank you.